Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. So it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you for this exceptional seminar that we have today. And in this seminar, you will see that Julie will touch upon some of the most critical issues and most pressing issues of our time. I think I don't need to spend a lot of time introducing Professor Julie Battilana. You already had some of you the pleasure of exchanging with her. But as a pioneer, in the study of hybrid organizations, Professor Battilana has produced groundbreaking research that has really changed the way we think about how business can foster positive change. And so in today's seminar, Professor Battilana, Julie will provide some seminal insights in order to summarize the studies she has been producing so far. And this seminar will serve also as a fitting prelude, if you wish, to the ceremonies that will take place this afternoon. So as you know, this afternoon we will you will receive a doctor honoris causa, an honorary doctorate, in order to honor the groundbreaking research you have produced. So without any further ado, the floor is all yours, and we are all ears. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Guilhem. Thank you so much for having me and for being here this morning. I know how busy this time of the year is, so I'm very grateful. I know we have 2 hours, so I actually, as Guilhem mentioned, prepared an overview of the work I've been doing so far, and my objective is to also highlight some of the pressing questions that I think we ought to pay more attention to. So let me just, before I get started, say that please do not hesitate to interrupt me at any point throughout. Let's try and make it as engaging and interesting for you as it can be. So at any point, if you have questions, suggestions, comments, please go ahead. We shouldn't wait until the end. We should do it as we go. And I promise that in case I see that in terms of time I need to move forward, if you do not mind, I'll just say that we just need to move forward to make sure that I get your reaction to some of the content. But again, please go ahead, ask all the questions along the way. I'm very much looking forward to your insights and reactions. Okay, so let me, and so I just want to make sure I get to understand how this one works. Here it goes. Okay, so let me tell you what I prepared and what I hope we can do together. What I want to do first is set the stage for the key questions I'd like us to tackle. We'll talk about the interaction between business and society. Then I'm going to turn to the topic of hybrid organizations that has been at the core of my research for the past 2 decades. Then what I'd like to do is use this opportunity to give an overview of what I've learned through my research and through many of my colleagues' research on hybrid organizations. And then that's going to lead me to talk more about the need to reintegrate power and purpose as we study organizations. And I'll conclude with a set of key future research directions that I think are critical ones that we ought to pay more attention to and that I look forward to getting your reaction to. So let me start with the interactions between business and society. I'm going to start with a topic we discussed yesterday during the panel, which is the multidimensional crisis that we're all facing and that we've been facing for many years now. The crisis has not only been a tragic crisis related to the pandemic, it's also been, and it continues to be, a crisis that's a social and economic crisis characterized by rising inequalities, a crisis, by the way, that has affected different parts of the population within countries and across the world differently. On top of this crisis, as we all know, we've been experiencing and we continue to experience a major environmental crisis that has officially entered the red zone for all species on this planet, including ours. And on top of this crisis, we continue to experience a major political crisis. It is the 17th year in a row that democracy has been declining across the globe. Right? Now, let's talk about companies. Companies have obviously been deeply affected by the crisis, the multidimensional crisis. But they've also played a role in creating and reinforcing this crisis. Here are just some of the key numbers, and I want to put emphasis on the role they've played in reinforcing inequalities on the one hand, and the role they've played in the environmental crisis on the other hand. So let's start with the role companies have played in reinforcing inequalities. This is a graph that I'm sure many of you have seen that's looking at the ratio, looking at the CEO compensation versus worker compensation. As you can tell, in the mid-1960s in the US, the ratio was close to 20. And if we look at the ratio today, what we have is a ratio that's higher than 300. Now, we also have, and I'm sure you're familiar with those, a number of statistics now about this ratio in some of the European countries. In France, the CAC 40 CEOs made more than 130 times the average worker pay in 2021. And here is the number for the UK, where we see that the FTSE 100 CEOs made more than 100 times the median full-time worker pay as of 2024, based on the latest information that we have. Now, if we turn to the role of companies in the environmental crisis that we're facing, we also have a number of statistics that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, so I'm just reminding you of these things here. 35% of global fossil fuel and cement emissions between 1965 and 2018 can be attributed to just 20 fossil fuel companies. We also know that 78% of the world's 500 largest public companies do not have emissions targets in line with the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees limit to warming. And in the meantime, we may be thinking, could it be that at least companies stopped investing money in lobbying and disinformation on these critical topics? Well, the bad news is that some have, certainly, and they care deeply, but some haven't. And so the 5 largest oil and gas companies in the world invested more than $1 billion on misleading climate-related branding and lobbying in the 3 years following the Paris Agreement. Again, I know we're all aware of those critical things, but this is the situation we're facing. So what we all know is that if we stay the course and if companies do not change, we know what's going to happen. It's been documented in many studies, in management, in economics, in sociology. What will happen is clear. We will further increase inequalities, and we will further destroy the planet, and then we'll be able to say, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Right. So here we are. Calls for change, not surprisingly, as we all know, are everywhere across the world. And calls are all about companies shifting from a model that's focused on shareholder value maximization, the pursuit of profit as the only goal, to the pursuit of multiple goals, social, environmental, and financial goals all at once. Calls abound across sectors, including in academia. If we look at publications over the past few years, many books, many articles have been written across fields of management, economics, sociology that relate to this critical question of how do we operate a shift from the traditional business model that we've been using to a different one that accounts for multiple objectives. I just want to be more specific and sort of talk about the different stakeholders. This shift is a priority for citizens. It is a priority for citizens in Europe, so that's information and data from the European Union, where more than 80% of EU citizens approve of regulations holding companies accountable for human rights and environmental violations. And more than 80% of Americans agree that companies should consider the interest of the communities where they operate and that they should actually follow through on their climate commitments. Employees care as well, especially the younger generations. We now have all the data showing that they do care. 59% of Gen Z and 64% of millennials consider that it is important for them to work for a company with a strong commitment to addressing climate change. That's a core priority for them. In fact, fewer than half of European and American workers are actually satisfied with environmental protections in their countries, and they work their companies to do more on this critical front. I want to highlight the fact that we shouldn't just be looking at the glass as being half empty. We should also be looking at it as being half full. There's a story of hope in the sense that there's increased awareness of these issues, and all of the different stakeholders I've mentioned, together with public authorities and with companies, have taken steps that seem to be going in the direction of addressing the crisis and the problems we've been discussing. So more and more companies, certainly in their discourse, commit to taking action and to shifting toward more sustainable models. And some have tried and continue to try to change their processes and systems. And I've had the opportunity over the past few years to follow some of them from inside, conducting field research, studying the changes in the making. And the good news, and I know many of you do this kind of work, is that some of them are really trying. Now, the next question is, are they succeeding? And do we see impact at scale, right? But for now, we're talking about the story of hope. So let's talk about the fact that some of them are actually really trying to make these changes happen on the ground. In the US, I'm sure you followed that at the time, in 2019, the Business Roundtable, gathering all the corporate leaders of large American companies, pledged to serve a variety of stakeholders through measures including fair worker compensation and ethical and sustainable business practices. And they were clear about the need to shift from their shareholder maximization model to a model serving all stakeholders. And obviously here, in the US and more specifically here, in Belgium and across Europe, I'm saying here in the US. See, this is interesting how Julie, you're not in Boston anymore. This is it. You moved, that's the jet lag. I'm sorry. So here in Europe and here in Belgium and across Europe, something so important happened in March. So just last month with this European Council approval of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is a major shift. I have to tell you that in the US, when I talk with my colleagues, when I talk with people who care about sustainability issues, we talking about Europe. We talk about Europe, the fact that Europe is ahead, Europe is doing more. Those directives, including this one, play a really important role in all those conversations, highlighting what could happen, how regulation could change across countries, across the world. Yes, Yann.
Maybe just for a story of hope. So regarding this business roundtable pledge that was super highly influential, there was this study by Battilana and Talarita, and basically they observed whether the firm which has signed the pledge, 200-ish, they walk the talk. So they did apply what they have pledged to do, and they found out that out of the 200-something firms that signed this CEOs that signed the agreement, exactly. This one, it was nine out of 200.
Absolutely. So this is where it is the story of hope and disillusion. And you're right. So that's a very important study. And others have been conducted. That's exactly what you're describing. 2 years after they signed, most of the signatory companies had not changed corporate governance guidelines to increase commitments to stakeholders, right, and to reduce shareholder primacy. And you're referring to, Guilhem, exactly the additional data that we see across a number of other studies as well. During the pandemic, interestingly, they also committed labor-related and environmental compliance violations more often than the companies that didn't sign. And they had higher carbon emissions than the non-signatories. So you're absolutely right to draw our attention. They signed, the commitment was made publicly, not much changed. And when it comes to regulation, because there's a way to say Europe is so ahead of the game and a lot is happening, but I know, and I look forward to getting your reactions to that as well, that here in Europe there are also many conversations about, okay, what is it that got voted in the end? Did we take out too much for the different voters to sort of say, okay, we're moving forward. And then knowing that this is the body of law that we have now, the key question is going to be, are we going to be able to implement it? And how are we going to enforce the implementation so that the new body of laws actually translates into changes inside corporations, right? So those are all indeed critical issues we're facing and reasons for us to step back and really think more about assessing the progress we've done up until now. So certainly discourse has changed, but practices inside companies haven't. Not in all companies, obviously some of them have made those changes happen, but some of them have not been able to make that happen. I actually studied a number of these companies. Some of them are very often used as examples. I cannot name these companies, and I will not do so because I have to obviously respect the confidentiality agreements, but some of them are quite often used as exemplar in terms of operating the transition, and I haven't studied all of them. I have studied some of them from inside, and what I can say is that I see a real intention to make the changes happen, a desire and a real commitment from the top of the organization and the employees, at least for some of them, but I also see many struggles. And what I end up seeing in the end is many situations in which people are trying to operate the shift, and yet somehow the shift is not sustained. Or it happens within a niche, and it is not then spreading to the rest of the organization, right? So there's a gap between discourse and practices, and together with Marisa Kimsey and our colleague Thijs Gerard, we studied one of those large multinationals and just published a paper last year describing what we see, which is, again, mostly pockets of innovation that are all about trying to operate the shift. These pockets being sustained because the leaders and the people working inside those pockets do everything they can to try and isolate themselves from the pressures that are just about shareholder value maximization. But then after 4 years comes the moment when you have to re-inject that pocket inside the organization. And this is when it's really hard, as we all know, for these pockets to continue to survive. Best case scenario, they survive, but they do not help yet change the rest of the model that's a dominant model inside these organizations. So the challenge is moving beyond greenwashing and impact washing, right, as we all know. And doing so is extremely challenging because it requires going against the rules of the game. Right? And overall, what we see is that, yes, discourse might have changed, but the system, the ecosystem in which companies evolve has not changed. So there's one way to think about what I presented, which is to say, oh, the problem is really with companies because they're being so resistant to change. But in reality, these companies, the people working in these companies, are operating inside an institutional context that's still all built to have them do mostly what they've been doing for the past decade. So what we're asking them and we're expecting them to do is very complicated because we're asking them to diverge from the existing institutional pressures. And we talk about the need to change, but we haven't changed that system. Now, what I'm saying, though, is not true about Europe, where this new directive and the changes to the legal ecosystem are such that we're moving in the direction of making it easier for companies to operate these changes. But to be fair, these changes are not happening in many other areas of the world, and it's raising questions for companies in Europe and across the world. Right. Now, as I said, and this is a core part of my work, like I study change inside organizations and at the societal level, and it's been a thread in all the work I've been doing over the past 20 years. And the kind of change we're talking about for those companies transitioning from the traditional model of shareholder value maximization to the pursuit of social, environmental, financial objectives, that's a great example of a divergent change. And the problem with these divergent changes is that they break with the existing norms that people take for granted. They break with the dominant culture. They break with the existing structures of power. And so the problem in those situations is that when we want to push for a divergent change, people may say, this is very innovative, thank you so much. But we're afraid it cannot be done because it's never been done before. And this is the core of what I see in the data I'm collecting inside those large corporations at the moment. And this is very much the life of social entrepreneurs working in these large corporations, right? So when you're breaking with the existing structures of power, when you're breaking with the existing norms, you're facing more resistance. And so these divergent changes are much more difficult to implement. What I do see, though, in my research is that, yes, they're more difficult to implement, but it's not impossible to implement these divergent changes. And so we do know, and we have a lot of examples, in fact, of organizations, companies that have been able to pursue these multiple objectives in a sustainable way over time. And so the critical thing then becomes for us to understand how have they been able to do that. And this is the reason why I've spent the past 2 decades studying hybrid organizations, as I call them, to try and gain a better understanding of how organizations can sustain the pursuit of these multiple objectives over time. So let me turn to hybrid organizing. And let me be very clear. I'm not standing in front of you here today trying to say, oh, I want you to use the term hybrid organizing, and this is really important to me to make sure that this is how we call these organizations. I just want to be crystal clear and transparent. When I started doing my research, I cared deeply about understanding these forms of organization diverging from the dominant model. I got to understand the lay of the land in terms of existing theories. I could tell that institutional theory would be a very helpful set of concepts and tools for me to use to make sense of the data that I was collecting. I also had to find a way to engage my colleagues in a conversation in the academic field so that we could all together discuss these things. And this is how I ended up using that concept of hybrid organizations. I do realize there are many other literatures dealing with this exact same phenomenon. So I know a number of you are working in these different sets of literature, so please don't consider that this is my way of saying this is how we should talk about them. This is just how I talk about them, but I very much look forward to an exchange and to talking about the other ways to tackle these critical questions and better understand the phenomenon from a conceptual apparatus standpoint as well. So let me just tell you about what I mean when I talk about hybrid organizing and hybrid organizations. So my interest, as I just mentioned, has been now for a long time and was early on when I started my research to look at those organizations that pursue social and environmental goals alongside financial ones, and to study them across sectors and try and understand how they're able to sustain the pursuit of these multiple objectives. And what they have in common, these organizations, is that they engage in hybrid organizing defined as combining the activities, structure, processes, and meanings of typical businesses and typical social sector organizations. Right? Some people in the field of institutional theory would talk also about them combining logics, right? Different ways of thinking about the world that people tend to take for granted. You can also think about them as combining organizational archetypes. But at the end of the day, you have kind of set of norms related to what it means to be a social sector organization on the one hand, a business organization on the other hand. And what these organizations are doing is that they're combining aspects of both, and as a result, they're diverging from the archetypes, the dominant logics, the ways of organizing across these different sectors. Examples of hybrid organizing, to make that a little bit more concrete, I'll just put emphasis on two types of hybrid organizations I've studied, and then we'll talk about more of them as we go. But one example is microcredit organizations that aim to help people get out of poverty through access to financial services to which they used not to have access to. These organizations pursue a social mission. They engage in commercial activities to sustain their operations and to actually deliver the service that they want to deliver. Another example is work integration social enterprises. As you know, these organizations that exist across the world, they aim to help people who've been unemployed to get back on the job market. And to do so, they hire these people who've been unemployed. And the people work inside this organization to deliver services, products, and as they work inside these organizations, they also get trained. So again, a great example of a set of organizations that pursue a social mission. It's all about helping unemployed people reintegrate the workforce. It's all about training them, but they support at least part of their operation through the generation of commercial revenues associated with the activities in which the beneficiaries engage as they work inside the work integration social enterprise. Right, so those are two examples. Among many others, I also studied bank cooperatives, different kinds of cooperatives across the world that are other great examples of hybrid organizations. And I know many of you study different kinds of hybrid organizations that you may or may not call hybrid organizations, but that are all about the pursuit of these multiple objectives. Okay, so the thing about these organization hybrids is that, as I've mentioned, they diverge from the dominant, legitimate, established forms of organization. They are neither typical corporation nor typical not-for-profits or charities. And so the thing is that they fall in between two very well-established categories. Right? And what we've learned from all of the work that has been done in sociology on categories and combining components of categories and diverging from the dominant ones is that there's a cost you pay to hybridizing, to combining. Now you're in between, and you're less likely to be regarded as legitimate by the different actors in a given field of activity in which you are. So the challenge for this organization is that they diverge, they innovate, but they're less likely to be regarded as legitimate, which obviously makes it harder in those situations to have access to resources, from financial resources to the talent of people who could come and join this organization. All of these things have been well documented. In fact, not only in the kind of hybrid organizations I talked to, but when it comes to any kind of organizational form, combining components that people are not used to seeing being combined. Now, that being said, what I want to put emphasis on is something obvious, but that I want to clarify for everyone, is that obviously hybrid organizations are not new. They've actually existed for a very, very long time. If we think about it, I would say that their antecedents actually date back at least to the consumer and worker cooperatives that emerged in the beginning of the 19th century in response to the social conditions of the Industrial Revolution. And since then, more recently, what we've seen is this huge trend related to social enterprise. Many of us in the room actually study these social enterprises. The social enterprises I'm talking about are organizations that pursue the social, environmental, financial objectives all at once. As you know, the term appeared in the 1980s. And over time, we've become more and more aware of these organizations. And what we've seen over the past decades is that social enterprises have actually emerged across sectors, across industries, across the world. They've become more widespread. And what we also do know is that the whole field of social impact investing has emerged and is in the process of further developing itself, bringing money, necessary investment to these organizations. Here is the latest information we have about, like the size of that social impact investing sector. More than $1.1 trillion going into investment into those social enterprises. Although this may seem like a big number on the slide, for those of us working with these social entrepreneurs and social enterprises, what we hear all the time, and we see one study after another, is the frustration of the people working in the sector of social enterprise, needing more investment, more money, not having access to it, and them hearing from the social impact investors that it's not easy for them, social impact investors, to find the kind of organizations that they need to invest in. So there's still a gap. And the critical component is how do we close that gap? But the field has been growing. And I thought it'd be interesting for all of us to see. Here is what I did. I did something very simple. I actually use Factiva and use the term social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social venture, social business. And here is the curve, interestingly. Right? This is what you see in terms of how popular these terms have been across publications, and certainly a huge rise. And there seems to be a little bit of a plateau now, but like that's what the trend has been over the past 20 years or so. Before I go any further, what I also want to clarify is that I'm thinking about hybridity as a spectrum. Right? We talked about social enterprises, what these social enterprises do, and here are some well-known social enterprises, some I've studied, some I've written cases on, but social enterprises combine the social and commercial and environmental objectives at their core. Right? Those are the core objectives that they pursue, and they care about those, and they organize themselves around all of those objectives, or at least the social and financial, or environmental and financial. Now, this is only one kind of hybridity, one may say. Here is what we also need to discuss. What we need to discuss is that we see an increasing number of companies, and we just talked about that earlier in the presentation, that actually engage in some form of hybridization. Those are the companies that are trying to operate the shift from a model that's the traditional model of shareholder value maximization to a model that's about the pursuit of these multiple objectives, right? And new legal forms have emerged, new initiatives like, the benefit corporation have emerged to enable corporations to operate this shift and try and create the kind of legal environment that they would need to succeed in operating this shift. At the other end of the spectrum, we also have examples of not-for-profit organizations that engage in some commercial activities to sustain parts of their operations, and for some of them, all of their operations. Some not-for-profits are created as hybrids from the beginning, right? They are all about pursuing a social objective and they engage in some commercial activities. Some not-for-profit have made the decision to commercialize and engage in commercial activities. This is a critical moment for me in that conversation because I want to make it very clear that this is the social scientist here speaking and saying, those are the trends we see. We see an increased hybridization of the economy. Now, the next question may be, but is this good, Julie? And now I'm going to be the citizen speaking, and I'll tell you that I think it is actually a necessity and it's good that the corporate world is hybridizing and integrating the social and environmental objectives. Do I think that it's good that not-for-profit are necessarily commercializing? I think this is a topic open for conversation. I think for some of them, commercializing may actually not be a good idea and may create some risks. For others, it may make sense in their model and it may make sense from the beginning. But again, I'm not saying from a normative standpoint this is a good trend we're seeing. I'm saying this is a trend we see, and this is a trend that deserves to be further studied. Now, this is actually leading me to my own research agenda. And so if we look back to the past 100 years that we have of research in management and best practices that we've highlighted and that we teach our students in the classroom, we've learned a lot about how companies can maximize profit. And if we think about the studies we're still conducting and publishing, I think it's fair to say we are still learning a lot. And it's probably fair to say we could learn a lot more as to getting deeper into some of the boundary conditions. But the thing is that if we're serious about pursuing not only profit, but profit as well as social and environmental objectives, then we have to accept that it could well be that what we've learned about maximizing on one dimension doesn't apply to the pursuit of multiple objectives. So it requires for us to step back and question the body of knowledge we have and say, out of what we've learned, what is it that applies to the pursuit of multiple objectives? And what is it that doesn't apply to the pursuit of multiple objectives? What are the new questions we need to ask? And could it be that there are practices in which what I call hybrid organizations that you can call differently, but these social businesses, you may say, what is it that they need to know to be able to operate at a time when we want them to operate the shift, but we do not really have all that body of knowledge to help them operate it. And so when it comes to the reason why I study these hybrid organizations and why conceptually I've decided to zoom in on them, it is because to me, hybrid organizations are a fantastic example of what the American sociologist Eric Olin Wright called real utopias. Right? They are alternatives to dominant institutions and dominant social structures that are viable and achievable. And my objective has been and continues to be to understand what it is that makes them viable and achievable so that corporations trying to operate the shift can learn from them and we can start building the body of knowledge that's needed to help them operate the shift. Because again, there's one way to look at the story, which is to say, companies, people working in them are not making the shift happen. But again, where's the body of knowledge? Where the institutional kind of context that's supporting them? I feel that we as academics have a critical role to play in helping everyone better understand what's needed so that we can better support the work of those who are trying to make the changes happen. And so the core research question at the heart of my research has been and continues to be, how can hybrid organizations sustain the joint pursuit of their multiple social, environmental, financial objectives over time? So I just wanted to set the stage so that you better understand where I come from, what my motivation is, and now what I want to do is share with you what I've learned, not only from my own research, but also from so many of my colleagues' very insightful research when it comes to answering this critical question of how can this sustain the pursuit of multiple objectives. Questions, reactions, I was about to say, before I dive into that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I wanted to hear you more about the link between hybrids and alternatives, because in your presentation, the first slide, you were talking about alternatives, and do you consider that hybrids are necessarily alternative? Because we could also see them as, conforming to diverse sets of logics, and so trying to align with the plurality of institutions rather than trying to contest them. So in your empirical work, are there maybe some boundary conditions under which some hybrids would endorse this goal of proposing an alternative, trying to change the rules of the game, and maybe others less?
So I see them as alternative to the extent that they diverge from the existing dominant archetypes or forms. I get your question though, which I think is a very important and fair question, which is, at the end of the day, is really what you're calling hybrid organizations a way to sustain capitalism as is? Or are some of these hybrid organizations really challenging the system? I'm going to take it one step further and say, am I one of these, would people, and can people look at what I do and say, oh, here is a very dangerous lady who's actually looking at organizations so that capitalism can be sustained, right? No, but I'm pushing it and being more provocative because, those are questions that I've been asked, and those are questions I ask myself as well. I study organizations that want to diverge, and I think to me this is the critical component, that want to diverge, and some of them do, and some of them don't. And I think this is the big difficulty with this kind of work. And the difficulty is that as organization scholars, what we need is access to organizations. And a number of organizations can raise their hand and say, yeah, please come in, researchers, come and study us. And we actually want to operate that shift. And come and see if we manage to operate it. And some of them try and they fail, and then some of them try and they succeed. The challenge I've seen as a researcher is that it's very rare to find organizations who are open enough to say, come and study us. And we're actually very open to you having access to all of the information, and beyond discourse, this is what we really want to do, and we want you to tell us if we're really changing or if we're not changing. Like, are we becoming one of those alternatives, or are we just in the end using discourse and then decoupling and continuing to reproduce the status quo? And what I can tell you is that I have studied organizations that have truly diverged, and I have also studied organizations that claimed they were diverging, and some of them really wanted to but didn't manage to, and some of them never wanted to, but were using the discourse as a way which we've seen across the history of organizations to justify the reproduction of the status quo. And the excellent work of John Mayer on decoupling is still so relevant. Like if I'm looking, and I don't want to generalize, because even looking at the large multinationals I'm studying, they do not all fall in the same place. Do I have some examples of organizations where I'm going through all the data now with my doctoral students, and I'm like, beyond decoupling, it's hard to see what we have that's going to be truly novel and an alternative, yes. But in other cases, what we see is real divergence and experimenting, I would say. And then the experimenting in some cases is then sustained and leads to new processes and systems, and in some cases the experimenting fails, and then they go back to the traditional model. Yes, please.
Just a prod on your thing about non-profits,
yeah,
and where they get money. I just think sometimes it's a kind of false dichotomy that they could choose between commercializing or not.
Yeah.
Because at least in the field that I work in, sustainable agriculture, what we see is that an increasing amount of philanthropic funding basically comes from the benefits of capitalism. So it's the Bezos Earth Fund, it's Melinda Gates Foundation, and it's the Moore Foundation, which was founded by the founder of IBM. So basically, non-profits in this space can either sell their knowledge into a market economy, or they can basically take money which is the product of the market economy. So it's kind of, it's not a real choice.
I agree with you, and I think you're highlighting the difficulty of what it's like to be a hybrid in that context where the pressures coming from the institutional context are such that, as you said, like it's really hard to maintain a fine line when the pressures through the money you're getting, through the market pressures, are really incentivizing you to do things a certain way, if only to survive. Now, what I want to put emphasis on is that if we look, I was at the, like the Social Enterprise Initiative at Harvard Business School celebrated its anniversary. And I vividly remember for the 20th anniversary, we were having a whole debate and a panel discussion. And what was really important to me related to your point was to say that up until now, what has happened, and Woody Powell has beautifully documented these trends in his work on not-for-profit, what has happened is that the discourse has been going from companies that know how to run the show and how to be efficient to not-for-profit organizations and social enterprises with an eye on, hey, you guys are so inefficient in terms of your processes and systems, learn how to do it professionally. Like I'm caricaturing, but that discourse was quite predominant for a number of decades, right? So the shift I'd like to help operate, and I'm not alone, so many of us are there, is that my experience in studying hybrid organizations, some of them being not-for-profits, some of them being created with a social enterprise legal status right across different countries, is that there is a lot we can learn from these organizations at a time when now companies are facing the challenges and need to operate the shift. Now, I do realize that as I say that, and I say there's so much we can learn from them that should inform what's happening here, and not only the corporate world saying to the rest of the organizations across sectors, oh, this is how you need to do it. The truth is that because the institutional context has not changed, we're still very much in a world where those organizations are facing pressure to then align more with the dominant model in the corporate world. So yeah, absolutely. Other questions, reactions? Yes?
One question about the joint pursuit of social, environmental, and economic
Yeah.
objectives that you mentioned, because it seems to be like taken for granted that it is one common element for all the companies you study. But
Yeah.
I suppose there are a lot of variations
Yeah.
in how they
Yeah.
have this joint perspective or how they consider how balancing different stakeholders. I'm sure it's not, is it not an important question to ask before knowing how to sustain that, since we don't know what is this debt about?
So in every context I'm looking at, what I'm doing is studying this critical component first, which is what are the objectives that are actually core to this organization. Back to the question of what are we really studying. And you're absolutely right to say, Valerie, that in some contexts, organizations, and especially historically, some of them in the social enterprise sector have sort of cared about the social objectives, like work integration, social enterprises, the social objective they were pushing, and the financial ones. I would say that more and more in the social enterprise sectors, the organizations I'm studying now make it clear that they've operated the shift from just environmental and financial or just social and financial to all three of those objectives being core and central to what they do. So in fact, as I'm about to summarize the findings from the literature, you'll see that what you're talking about is the first key findings that I'm going to highlight. So you're right to say that how is it that those objectives are chosen and how is it that they're integrated to the DNA of the organization is absolutely critical, and you're absolutely right that there are changes and differences across settings and across organizations. In your work, do you have some key findings on these things?
The point that we discussed also, I'm thinking about a study by Corentin, I'm not asking you the question, about this idea in organization when they say they want to adopt a balancing perspective from different stakeholders, and you say that's easy to say, but in real life, how do you do to really consider all different perspectives that are diverging between each other, and how you make sense of that and you still keep your soul, I would say, and what you want
It's extremely complicated.
It's really the question that I think a lot of companies are facing today when they want to integrate more than shareholders, is how to do when there are conflicts in between what people expect.
And the reality, because I think this is important, we've heard a lot about shared value and alignment and win-win. And for those of us who study these organizations, the first thing I would say is that the commonality across all of them is trade-offs, and trade-offs daily, minute by minute, on every single dimension. And so you're right to say that then the challenge becomes, how do you deal with these trade-offs without losing sight of one set of objectives or the other? Corentin, you wanted to... I just want to make sure you get a chance to jump in if there's something you wanted to add.
I had other thoughts about what you were talking about. No, I'm just thinking when I look at your continuum, the previous slide, or the next slide,
I'll go back here.
Is that something that I see in common here, is that there is no state involved, or perhaps the state can give money, but all of those organizations, so we accept that capitalism led to negative externalities for society, for the planet, but here we can only see private initiatives and not public initiatives. So I'm just wondering, when I look at those companies, this very nice examples of Patagonia, for instance, it manufactures jackets or equipment and so on, and says that, we give 10% of benefits to charities, we make sure that we treat our workers and the communities well in the process, but still it's a for-profit organization, and I'm thinking if all these initiatives are not justifying capitalism, and with it all the negative aspects of capitalism, and by doing so reduce the mere idea of the role of the state. And that it's just the market that is simply regulating itself by creating or giving money to those sustainable agriculture initiatives or to those not-for-profits.
So if you think about my intellectual journey and why I'm zooming in on the hybrid organization, is that when I started my PhD, the theories of the firm and they're still core and central and dominant. And so you're talking to a set of people who are just like, give me a counterexample. Like, can you show to me that something that's, to me, a nonsense can actually be sustained and do reasonably well economically and pursue those objectives? So my approach at the org level, looking at the private entities, has been to say, let me show to you that even in a context in which public policies have not yet changed, some organizations are able to do it. Now, it doesn't mean I'm taking the state out of it. And when we're going to get to the future research directions, I'll tell you more about the study I'm working on now. I went from being full-time at a business school to being 60% of my time at a business school, 40% at a school of government, to being 50% at a business school, 50% at the school of government. Starting in June, I'm going to be 75% of my time at a school of government and 25% at the business school. So this is because when I started my PhD, I wanted to study lobbying. And so I was very much centered on the state. So to me, states and public policies play a critical role, because I actually do not think that the shift we're looking at now can happen unless policies and legal environments actually quite radically change. And I'll go as far as saying that I think that fiscal policies will actually need to change. Because you cannot be in a world in which you do good, you do well, you do well, you do good, if fiscal policies have not clearly evolved to incentivize companies to do things differently. Now, let's imagine a world, and that's why I'll say that at the end. I'm working now on a study looking at differences across countries across the world, trying to code all of the legal differences related to sustainability laws, labor laws, and so on, to look at companies' ability to sustainably pursue the social, environmental, financial objectives. As I say that, I'm just going to say I'm deeply aware of the fact that the databases we have at the moment are also far from ideal, as we all know, because they were created by organizations and companies that you may say have an interest in reproducing things the way they are. But we do have some data we need to start working with. I do believe that as a field, we have a responsibility, which is that I think we should get all together collectively and think about the kind of data we need to collect so that we can really look at those questions without the filter and bias of the existing system. Now, let's imagine we can do all that. You could also then again still, and that goes back to the question we discussed earlier, look at me and actually say, fantastic, but at the end of the day, this is still the reproduction of a system that's not that far from the system that we have. That's kind of a form of capitalism that's putting people and the planet back at the center, but that's still a form of capitalism. And yes, absolutely. And so I think that the debate around that is also a very healthy one, where some people may say what's needed is a much more radical and divergent change. So how are you thinking about that?
We have to see over the long run if it changes.
You're right.
Then we can
and
see.
then where we are as those changes happen. Yes.
Because I'm very skeptical about, even though I give corporate social responsibility courses about CSR, I'm very cynical about corporate social responsibility, thinking that, okay, that's good, you compensate or you try to reduce your externalities, but at the end of the day, you still produce externalities, negative externalities, and you do not fully compensate them. And we had this discussion yesterday during the debate by Jean-Paul Larson, who said, yeah, we had this very great example of this company, airline company, looking for other type of fuels to reduce, and that was great. And no, if you want to be great as an airline company, you need to reduce the number of flights that you're operating. That's very costly for you. So you have to accept the cost so that it becomes more moral somehow. And I don't see most of the time the cost for these organizations who are trying to.
And for sure, for those transitions to happen, and that's related to the work I've been doing with Isabelle Ferreras and Dominique Méda, we talk about the pillars of democratizing firms, decommodifying work, and depolluting, like decarbonizing the planet. And what you're saying is very important in the sense that, and this is where the state, again, plays a critical role, we have to be realistic. For such shift, like the one you're talking about to happen, which will ultimately need to happen for us to save the planet, we're going to need to work with people so that they can be trained and retrained, so that they can find jobs, right? So from that standpoint, there's a role of the state to regulate and change the laws and create the kind of legal environment that we need, the kind of fiscal environment, but we're going to also need to decommodify work in a number of instances to enable people to transition from very polluting sectors to greener ones, and that's not going to happen overnight, but that's going to require the partnering between the private and the public sector to, in a very intense way, in fact, and even more intense than what we might have seen. And in the era of AI, we're going to see even more of that. And so the state, to me, is a critical actor in helping make those changes happen if we want to have a chance for them to happen. Okay, so what is it that we've learned about these hybrid organizations and the sustaining of the multiple objectives? In hybrids that place all of these goals at the core of what they do, then it's critical for them to sustain the pursuit of all these objectives, otherwise they fail. Like, you don't generate enough revenue, you fail, but if you fail to pursue your social and or environmental goals, depending on the core priorities that you have, you fail as well. So I already used the concept of logics, but some people in the literature use the concept of logics to further explain why it's so hard to combine those objectives, because they're rooted in different logics that are taken for granted norms and principles that guide behavior in a given sector of activity. So hybrid organization, we talked about it, combine aspects of what's taken for granted in those different sectors. And so as a result of that, that's exactly what we've been discussing through the questions you've asked and the comments you've shared. They are facing very divergent expectations from all those stakeholders. And it's making it very hard for them to do what they have to do as they operate, dealing with operations and transactions daily. Now, what happens as a result of those divergent expectations, and it's been documented by the literature on hybrids and across other streams of research, is that a number of risks emerge. The first risk that has been highlighted quite a lot in research is the risk of mission drift. So now you need to be financially sustainable. You also need to pursue their social and environmental goals. But the pressures for you to be financially sustainable are such, and that's exactly what we were discussing, that it becomes hard to keep track of all of these things. And back to the work of Selznick that already highlighted, how the cult of efficiency would make it really hard to sustain the pursuit of social values. What we see in a number of those hybrid organizations is that over time, they drift away from the social and environmental goals, and they become more typical commercial operations. Right? In some instances, some people have seen in their research that the opposite can happen, that the social and environmental aspect becomes so central and salient that these organizations do not handle the trade-offs the way they should anymore, and then they lose sight of the importance of their financial sustainability, and they cannot be sustained anymore, and they fail, and it's a case of bankruptcy, and they cannot exist anymore, and they cannot sustain the pursuit of the multiple objectives. The other risk that has been very well documented in the literature on hybrid organization is the risk of organizational paralysis. You're pursuing all of those multiple objectives. Different factions in the organization consider that one set of objectives is more important than the other. That leads to intractable conflict. And those conflicts are not only cognitive, they can become highly emotional, and they literally freeze the organization into inaction. It's something that I've seen in the study of microcredit organizations, one of them being Bancosol. I compared and contrasted Bancosol and Los Andes to microcredit organizations, and so that in one of them, over time, the conflict between the people carrying the social logic on the one hand, the financial logic on the other hand, became so intractable that the organization was literally frozen into inaction. So the thing then becomes, what can hybrids do to mitigate these challenges and to sustain their operations in spite of the constant tensions? And so here is what I want to do now. I want to summarize the key findings from that literature, and I'm going to do it in a way that's like novel and yet absolutely not novel. It's novel in the sense that I forced myself to try and summarize all of that, and please feel free to disagree with me, say, hey, you've forgotten this and this dimension, but I want to try this on you. What is it that we've learned? We've learned that the threats and challenges are pernicious and very difficult to overcome, one study after another. But we also found that there are key practices in which hybrids can engage that enable them to sustain the pursuit of multiple objectives, even though the institutional context has not yet changed. And so remember, my objective is to also highlight those counterexamples to sort of show, hey, we have them, those real utopias. And so as a result, we can now challenge the existing theories and actually prove that we need to theorize and theorize differently. Okay, so what is it that we've learned? I'm going to start with the key finding coming out of this research, which is that what I see in my own research and what we see across other studies that have been conducted is that the organizations that are able to sustain the pursuit of these multiple objectives have a hybrid culture. And what I mean by that is that their culture is committed to the social mission and environmental objectives of the organization, as well as to the creation and maintenance of effective operations. So both of their aspects are core and central to the DNA of these organizations that sustain the pursuit of the multiple objectives. Now, this is where I'm going to echo, Valerie, exactly what you were saying. What studies show is the importance of defining the social and financial goals. And Valerie, I'm going to further echo what you said. In most of my studies, based on the kind of organization that I was studying 10 years ago, the objectives were mostly social and financial, commercial. And now increasingly, they are social and environmental and commercial. If I think about microcredit organization, work integration, social enterprises, cooperatives, and so on. And I know that a number of you are looking at organizations that prioritize environmental objectives and are now increasingly bringing the social ones on board as well. What these organizations also have in common is that they pay close attention to designing tasks in the way that enables them to make sure that they take care of both the social and financial objectives. Like, it sounds obvious, but a number of those hybrid organizations, though, fail because they do not clearly define the key tasks that have to be performed for them to make sure that they do not lose sight of one set of objectives or the other set of objectives. Another critical component is the formal organization. Again, the organization that have these kind of hybrid cultures have processes and systems in place to track hybrid performance using KPIs that are about social, environmental, financial performance, and they reward people on all of those aspects. Right? And that's what we see, again, one study after another. This is not groundbreaking. This is aligned with what we would expect to find in organizational theory. But if you try to change your corporation, but you do not change the way in which you incentivize people, nothing is happening. And I'm saying that in such a way, but if I have to summarize a lot of the key findings I have now in the multinationals I'm studying, the ones that are not operating the shift, I was talking about those pockets of innovation. The pockets survive for some time because people inside those pockets are incentivized differently. And then the idea is that now you just have to be financially sustainable enough, you're re-injected. And it's like, okay, but what about how we are rewarded? Oh, you're rewarded the way everyone else is. So then this is it. It's making it almost impossible to sustain the operations. And then obviously critically people, and so what's key there is the recruiting and socializing of people into the pursuit of those hybrid goals. Right? And here, what I'm seeing through my research is that there's no recipe. It's not like, oh, you should make sure to hire always blank slates. Like as I compared Bancosol and Los Andes, the microcredit organizations, one of them, Los Andes, actually hired blank slates, like people who had not yet been socialized as bankers on the one hand and social workers on the other hand. They were people who were newly trained out of the university, who joined this organization and were really then socialized into working for a microcredit organization with a core social mission while delivering financial services. Bancosol struggled because they had bankers on the one hand and then social workers on the other hand. Now, I have seen examples of organizations that actually have people with such different profiles. You know, could be bankers and social workers, or people who are specialists and technical experts related to AI, for example, and others who are social workers. And I've seen some of these organizations actually succeed. So it's not like you always have to have the blank slates, but what these organizations that have very diverse profiles do to succeed is that they are very intentional in terms of how they socialize and train people. And the way they do it is, for example, through job shadowing. Oh, you are our AI expert. Why don't you go and spend a week working with our social workers so that you get to see what they do on the ground? Oh, you're a social worker. Why don't you go and spend a week understanding the work that our AI experts do? And then when it's time to attend a conference that's about AI, why not send someone who's a social worker to go with the AI experts? And when it's a social worker conference, let's send people as well. So these organizations are very systematic in enabling the training across field and in gathering people, getting them together, and creating the mutual trust and respect so that everyone understands what the other group is doing that's core and central to the organization. Now, some of you might have recognized the congruence model of my dear friend and colleague, Mike Toshman, with his co-author, Aurélie. And I have to give credit to Mike. For a long time, I was trying to fight it. And I was like, you know what? All of the findings we have in that literature on hybrid organizations, a lot of them can actually be summarized using the same kind of model they've developed to try and understand how you create the kind of culture you need to reach the kind of objectives you want to reach. But there is a but, I would say. And the but to me relates to decision making. In the work that Mike Toshman and his co-author Aurélie have done, a lot of the work is just top-down. And I'm about to share a study with you that will still be aligned with what we talk about, that's top-down. But then after that, I'm going to diverge myself and say that a lot of what I see in my own research is that these organizations that are able to sustain the pursuit of the multiple objectives, what I see one qualitative study after another is that they tend to have more democratic ways of deciding inside these organizations. They tend to involve more of the people into dealing with the trade-offs that are being faced daily so that everyone can then internalize the importance of the multiple objectives. So what I want to do is talk about the importance of cultivating the dual-minded leadership and findings related to that in a study I conducted recently. And then I want to go to this other point on more democratic ways of dealing with decision-making inside organization and new questions emerging from me that would diverge from the model because it wouldn't be just as top-down, but much more bottom-up based on the findings that I have. And I look forward to your reactions and seeing if what I find is converging with what you find or very different from what you find. Questions? Yes?
I just have a question related to the people issue that
Yes.
you mentioned.
Yes.
So I think I understand that what works best is when companies consider different sensitivity and they kind of oblige people to learn sensitivity from others.
Yeah.
That we're talking about. But I was wondering whether in the long term that you've been studying this subject, whether you saw a change in the people, in the people from the organization, because maybe their sensitivity to social issues, to sustainability has changed. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
I do.
You know, the things, the trends that the society is the changes in those sensitivities in terms of sustainability and social issues, does that change something in the organization, and does it make it easier for organizations to become hybrid organizations?
So the answer is yes. What I see that has changed in terms of the profiles of people is also that you have more people with a hybrid profile. So you do have more people now who've actually worked across sectors and apply for jobs with real experience and knowledge related to the various sectors, or who have themselves worked for hybrid organizations before. And these people are very helpful because they help create the bridges, right, from one group to the other. They speak both set of languages, and that's very helpful. The changes in the broader institutional context, I would say yes, but it's really dependent on how much has the institutional context really changed. And so if, for example, I compare what I see in the US versus what I see in France, I would say that in France, I see more of the context facilitating this changing and shift than I do in the US. Though in the US, you also have pockets of sectors and regions where it's facilitated, but others where it's absolutely not. And I'm sure you would see differences in France across territories as well. And it's interesting, in fact, because I'm working at the moment, I'm working on the adaptation of my book, Power for All in French, and I'm working with a French doctoral student, Romain Slitin, who is actually looking at the importance of the territory and how the local geographic community may be doing exactly what you're describing, yes or no, depending on the extent to which the kind of hybrid logic has become prevalent. And that's the result of, has it become prevalent across the different kinds of actors? So companies, public authorities, the citizens. And when that's the case, you see that the integration of people is so much easier because the culture is in place, it's really strong, and then people enter these organizations and manage to themselves operate a shift. The counter example I'm going to give you, though, is I've studied with Sophie Bach, who was a student here and is a dear colleague and friend of mine, a cooperative bank. And we have data about this cooperative bank at a time when the shift had not yet fully operated. And that large cooperative bank acquired a typical bank. And we have fascinating data, about the typical bankers joining the cooperative bank and really sort of saying to themselves, we landed on Mars like that. Everything these people are doing in these cooperatives make no sense. And then them, in a very imperialistic way, thinking, fortunately, they have us now. We can explain to them how to run a bank. And it's a sad story, but there was hope at the end. It's a sad story because the cooperative bank was all structured to avoid any kind of mission drift, you could say, except, it's hard to believe, but except that they didn't understand that now they added a whole new arm of investment banking to their activities that was just retail banking until now. So they continued to use their processes and systems that were all about hybridity for retail banking, but believe it or not, huge blind spots. They forgot that now they were responsible for investment banking. And then the financial crisis happened, and they were horrified to realize that they did as poorly as every other bank because they had not been monitoring what was happening inside that world, where people had absolutely not been socialized and were just convinced that these cooperative bankers, poor cooperative bankers, were not understanding what banking was about. And so then their way of dealing with that, they learned the lesson the very hard way, was to post-financial crisis have their banker trained into the hybrid approach become, kind of leaders across all of those other sets of activities, and they literally had to train, but for years. The bankers who stayed, many of them left, who were willing to engage. But for them it was harder because obviously at the time the shift had not yet happened. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So let's turn now to the cultivating the dual-minded leadership. What do I mean here? The challenge for the leadership of these hybrid organizations is to sustain their attention on those multiple objectives, which we know is a difficult thing to do. And dual-minded leadership consists of the strategies that organizational leaders and board members use to affirm, embody, and protect the organization's financial, social, and environmental values and objectives, and to address the tension that keep emerging in as productive a way as possible, and to address them as proactively as possible. So a key question is, what types of governance arrangements are conducive to the nurturing of this kind of dual-minded leadership that is necessary to sustain the pursuit of the multiple objectives? And what I want to do now is actually tell you about a paper that I wrote with my dear friend and colleagues Anne-Claire Pache and Channing Spencer. Anne-Claire is a faculty member and one of the people on the leading team at ESSEC, and Channing Spencer is one of my doctoral students at Harvard University. And this paper, An Integrative Model of Hybrid Governance, is a paper we just published actually in February. It just came out in AMJ. And I want to share with you some of the information about the setting and the key findings that we have that actually relate to that question of how do you deal with governance issues? And what we've learned from the literature on organizations, not only about hybrids, but also on hybrids, is that boards do play an important role, as we know, in ensuring that an organization remains focused on its core objectives. They have the potential to shape the organizational trajectories and, as a result, play a role in enabling organizations to sustain the multiple objectives. The other thing we've learned from the literature on hybrid is that a number of studies have found that for hybrid organizations to not drift, to remain focused on their multiple objectives, it seems to be critical for them to have members, we're going back to what we were just discussing, who represent the multiple logics that the organization combines. So in other terms, you either need people with a hybrid kind of mindset and hybrid set of experience, or you need a mix of people who bring the market experience and the social sector experience that they can work together to achieve the multiple objectives of the organization. Right? And what we know from research is that seems to be a really important guardrail to make sure that the attention of the leadership remains focused on the multiple objectives. The issue, though, is that it may well be a catch-22. Why? Because what we know, too, is that board members who actually carry different logics are quite likely to hold very different and potentially competing worldviews as to what's the right way to deal with to govern an organization and to govern a company, right? So the risk is that the tensions between the two groups, the two factions, like the market faction, if I caricature, and the social sector faction, that those tensions are going to become so strong that fault lines are going to emerge. And we know from the literature on boards, that's a very large body of literature, that when those factions get to enter into conflict and the fault lines emerge, it becomes really difficult for an organization, for a company to operate, right? Why? Because the fault lines can lead to conflict, and again, this conflict can become emotional ones in addition to cognitive ones, and so the result is that then those conflicts can really derail the organization, distract it from its goals, and the risk is that organizations then fail on all of the different goals that they're pursuing. And so the question becomes, how can institutionally diverse boards of hybrid organizations help sustain the pursuit of the multiple objectives, but in an effective way? Is it even possible? Like, it looks like if you do not have the multiplicity of backgrounds represented, then you drift in one direction or the other. Fine. So then you will need to have institutionally diverse board. But it looks like institutionally diverse board then enter phases of conflicts that are really detrimental. So is there a way to even avoid that? And what can we learn about that? That's what we looked at. And this is so relevant. I spoke briefly about that during the panel yesterday, because this is exactly what happened at OpenAI. I don't know if you followed what happened at OpenAI over the past few months. It started in November of last year. OpenAI, right, is a hybrid organization. And as you know, their commercial branch is commercializing ChatGPT. So playing a really important role in our economy and society today. So at OpenAI, what happened is that the organization was initially created as a not-for-profit with a commercial arm created later on. And the reason why they created it as a not-for-profit was that they were deeply aware that a key component of whatever they were about to decide when it would come to that technology would be, is this benefiting all of humanity? What's the kind of impact this is going to have on humanity? I do believe as a citizen that we need to celebrate the fact that from the very get-go, they were aware of the fact that this should not be created as a typical corporation. Now, as you know, in November 2023, board members actually grew increasingly concerned at the fact that they felt that the organization was drifting. That with ChatGPT now, the CEO, Sam Altman, was becoming much more commercial in terms of his focus for the organization and losing sight of the importance of the social component related to, wait, is this benefiting all of humanity? That actually led to the quite dramatic move that the board made, right? They actually made the decision to push Sam Altman to step down. So Sam Altman stepped down. I'm sure you followed that in the press. It was a whole saga for a number of weeks. There was a huge crisis that followed. A number of the employees actually were very vocal in asking for Sam Altman to come back. I think that we have to be careful too in thinking that at that point many employees had already left the organization because they didn't agree with the more commercial approach of Sam Altman. So, more needs to be studied and analyzed as to who was there before this happened, who was there when this happened. We see the employees taking a stand and a very specific one supporting Sam Altman, but is it that a lot of the ones who had issues had already left? Like, we're going to need to look into this in a very critical way. And so that's a perfect illustration of the fact that when you have people with a social orientation and experience and commercial one on the same board, which was precisely the case at OpenAI, conflicts can emerge. And these conflicts can be very detrimental because what we saw is that for a while, the organization was completely frozen. Employees didn't even know what would happen. They were unsure. And I'll go as far as saying that if you look at the board now, most of the board members have changed. Very few of them have remained. Sam Altman is back in his position as CEO again. And so, to me, what's going to happen now at OpenAI is absolutely critical as we think about the future of hybrid organizations. And I've actually been very worried about the fact that what I've seen in the press internationally following that event was that a number of people were saying, this is just far too complicated. Why would you create yourself as a not-for-profit and then have a commercial arm? Just be a typical business and operate so that you can be more effective. Now, if this is what comes out of this crisis, and this is the key takeaway, and this is the way the public opinion thinks about what's the right way to organize it, I think it's a huge, huge failure. Because we have an opportunity at that point to say, it's a different model, let's hold them accountable, like Sam Altman is back, but let's now give to Sam Altman some information about what we've learned about how the governance of this organization can be managed without becoming the typical corporation that some people say they should become. And I'm just finishing a piece on that for the Stanford Social Innovation Review with Anne-Claire and Chloe my RA with whom Le Mail, hey, with whom I'm working on that. And I actually just got the paper back from the editor at SSR this morning, so it's on my to-do list for tomorrow. So now, thinking about Sam Altman and what would I tell Sam Altman based on what I've learned, this is where this study is very helpful for us. In the study that we conducted with Anker and Chining, we looked at work integration social enterprises. I already talked about them. They are a great example of hybrid organization. They want to help people who've been unemployed reintegrate the workforce. They have a social mission. But then when they employ these people to help them get trained, they also generate revenues through the selling of the products or services that the beneficiaries they work with actually produce. And so what did we do? For this paper, we report on 5 work integration social enterprises with institutionally diverse boards. Let me tell you what happened behind the curtain of the review process. We had many more organizations, not 5, but 10 of them, in fact. And for 5 out of these 10, what we found that we thought was important because it was corroborating previous results, but that the reviewers didn't want because it was corroborating other results, was that 5 of them had board membership that was such that only one logic was represented, either the commercial or the social. And what we find is what the previous studies have found, so I'm sharing it because this is important, which is that these organizations were not able to sustain the pursuit of multiple objectives. They drifted. And they drifted in the direction you would expect. When people only have a commercial background, they just become all about the commercial goals and they forget the others. And when people only have a social background, they become all about the social and environmental objectives and they're not sustainable financially. So we found that for those other organizations. I'm not reporting on them because the reviewers at the end of the day thought we should just be citing the other research. Is probably fair, but I think it's good to know that it is what we find as well. Now, we zoomed in on the 5 organizations that actually had institutionally diverse boards. And so we used interviews, observations, we analyzed archival documents, and that enabled us to actually identify the board structures and processes that were associated in 2 of these 5 organizations with the sustained pursuit of the multiple objectives. So let me tell you more about the patterns of attentional engagement that we found. So basically, for you to understand, we looked at to what extent are the board members able to sustain their attention on multiple objectives versus just concentrating on a subset of these objectives. And so for 3 of the organizations, what we found is an oscillating pattern that we describe in detail in the paper and in the data that we have. What does this mean? It means that the board in those instances attended to either the social or financial goals for at least a year, right? And then at the end of that period of time, a year or 2 years, they experienced a major conflict. At that point, they were able to rebalance, and then unavoidably they put emphasis on the other set of goals, did that for an extended period of time, experienced another conflict, and then rebalanced. Again, this is aligned with what we find in a number of studies that have been conducted. Interestingly, the studies that were conducted in the past kind of said, this is the model. This is what hybrids have to do. This is the fate of hybrid organizations. You actually have to accept that you cannot really do multiple things at once. You're going to do one, then the others will get frustrated. They will be there, so they will tell you, hey, let's rebalance, so then you will balance. And then the problem, though, is that the periods of crisis are not just 2 days. Like in some cases, they are 6 months to a year. And in those moments, the organizations are not operating in an effective way, and some of them are even at risk of disappearing, which is highly problematic because then some people may say, well, then, Julie, thank you so much, but as you can tell, it's not sustainable because who's going to run an organization in such a way? What we do have that was not documented before in research on hybrid is that we have 2 of those companies that were actually able to maintain a dual focus on all of their multiple objectives over time throughout the study, and they did so without experiencing any kind of conflict, any kind of attentional lapses along the way. They were able to sustain their attention on multiple objectives over time. Now, how did they do it? So those are the key findings coming out of the study. first, these two companies actually had what we call protective board structures. What does that mean? It means that the board did not only include people having the social kind of experience and the more commercial market kind of experience, but the board was also organized in such a way that there was no way that over time one of these two groups could stop being represented on the board. So the bylaws, all the processes and systems were such that it was very clear that if I'm a member of the board and I'm bringing the social experience to that board, the person who is going to come and replace me will be a person who's going to have the similar kind of social experience and knowledge that's being brought to that board. So what it did is that it made the structure of the board and its composition stable over time, which was not the case in the other organizations. In addition to that, what we noticed is that the two organizations for which the boards maintained the attention and the multiple objectives had very, very specific kinds of relational leadership processes on that board. And I want to tell you more about those. And you can go to the paper if you want all the detail. And I apologize in advance some of the academic jargon that we're using to actually make sense of some of the findings. But again, we were going back and forth with reviewers who were pointing us to some really interesting literatures that we were accounting for in the paper. So I'm not going to go in depth into all of these things, but I want to share with you the key findings. So what are these relational leadership processes? First, you have a whole set of processes that are all about fostering board members' sense of responsibility for both social and financial goals. So how do they do that? They do that by systematically reviewing social and financial, and so Valerie, as I say that, I have to say that in the context of these organizations, they also dealt with environmental issues as they were going through, but for them it was under the social umbrella that they were doing it. Again, in other contexts it would be environmental, social, and financial. So they were systematic at every board meeting in reviewing all of those KPIs, not only the financial ones, but also the other ones. They also met regularly, and not only during the board meetings, but in between board meetings. And in fact, in both of these organizations, there was one member of that board who played a key leader role in that person made sure to connect with people in between meetings. But that person did more than that. That person knew that the people were speaking different languages, and they made sure in between meetings to prepare the board members so that they would understand the language that would be used in the board meeting that would not be only about their KPIs, but also the other KPIs, and helping educate them to better understand what it meant and why it was important to do so. And then, in both of these organizations, the leaders of the boards who played that bridging role were also very intentional in creating many opportunities for board members to interact outside of the boardroom. So obviously for every board, and for those of you who are board members, you know about that, there's the let's gather together, let's have dinner, like all of that happened in these organizations. But beyond that, what the leaders of this board did is that they organized field visits where they actually asked board members to be there and come. And they did the kind of job shadowing you would expect, that the board members who had more of a commercial background would on the field visit spend more time with the social workers on the ground. And the ones who had more of a social background would during the field visit go and spend more time with the people dealing with the financial realities of the organization. In addition to that, the other relational leadership processes actually relate to maintaining a two kind of way of communication between the board and the senior leadership of the organization. And how did they do that? Actually, the senior leadership was very, very regularly invited to come and present in front of the board and share their perspective and have a real dialogue with the board members. And the meetings with the senior leadership were also organized, again, not only during those board meetings, but outside of those board meetings. And anytime a board meeting happened, the leader of the board would then meet with not only the senior leadership, but everyone across the organization to explain what had happened in relation to all of the objectives and why they made the decision to deal with the trade-offs the way they did. Right? So what I have to say too, because I think it's important and it relates to the question you were asking about also the profiles of the people and the extent to which the context is helping, is that interestingly, on both of those boards, the person who played the leadership role and was the connector, was the person building the bridges, was a leader who themselves had a hybrid background. So they had extended experience in the market sector, the social sector, and in running hybrid organizations. And that helped them play their go-between role, right? They were able to translate the view of one group to the other while remaining loyal and faithful to the views of that group, but using a vocabulary that the other group could understand. And that use of the vocabulary made a hell of a difference, because what happened is that as a result of that on that board, everyone was educated to understanding the knowledge, KPIs, and approach of the people representing the other set of experiences and knowledge. So that's what I wanted to share with you when it comes to that study, which again, to me is important because it's a counterexample. You may be thinking, you cannot sustain governance in a hybrid organization over the long term. And now we had studies saying, yes, you can. It's going to be quite chaotic, but you can do it. Go through the conflicts, learn how to handle them. But what we find is that it's possible to do it without that kind of conflict. It takes work, for sure, but it's feasible. And under those set of conditions, this is actually what we find. So I want to turn to the last part of the talk, but do you have questions, reactions? Is that aligned with what you see, not aligned with what you see? Yes?
Just a question. Do you have this figure of the independent board member? Do you know this concept of independent board member? Because we have this figure in our corporate governance law in Belgium, in terms of the European level. And typically it's someone who's not involved in the day-to-day operation of the company. And the role of this type of board member is to keep all these interests all together, and it's very close to the figure of your leader here.
Yeah.
But so I don't know if you have.
So the leaders in both of these cases were the people who were part of the organization, but most of the other board members were independent. So they, in the building of the board, they were quite intentional in bringing people who had no stake in the organization. Not all of them, right? But they had a majority of board members who were independent. And you're right that those, but independent coming from both the social and commercial sector. And those played a critical role. What's interesting is that you have to say that if you are a board member in this kind of organization, this is also a shift for people who take board positions. Because now, like if you're taking a seat as a board member in this kind of organization, it may not be as prestigious still as taking a seat on another kind of, like company, where you're going to get a lot of money to do that as well. Now, this is the kind of position where you're not going to get paid or not going to get paid much. And based on what I described, you're going to need to invest time and energy and more work to do your work as an independent board member well, because you're going to be dealing with those different worldviews. Now, the people who do it also report, based on the data that we have, that those have been some of the most enriching and interesting experiences of their professional lives. And they also actually appreciate the fact that they feel they're doing something meaningful, and that as they do the work, they're experimenting and developing a novel model. And I haven't conducted the studies, but my guess is that the people who are on these boards and who then go back to their companies and their other boards probably also then deal with the challenges differently. So there could be, as we're discussing that together now, I'm sort of thinking it's an interesting study to look at the extent to which it's now socializing them in a hybrid logic and making them different leaders in their own companies or organizations. Yeah.
Maybe, Julie, what is really specific to social and environmental and economic aspects? Because if you look at the kind of results you have, I would say that it's kind of how to avoid conflict, but independently of what type of topics we are talking about. Am I a bit...
So in these organizations, and this is important because this is something I want to talk about too as I'm getting to the next part. In these organizations, it's not that they avoid conflict, like they do not avoid the tensions. They confront the tensions and they discuss them, right?
Yeah, because that was the point. It gives the feelings when you present
Yeah.
it like this that
I'm-
it's good
I'm-
to
I'm
have
glad-
no conflicts. Because even when you explain the example of OpenAI, at first we could say the board plays a good role.
It did.
They said.
They did. They said
there was
it's a
risk of
drift.
mission drift.
It's a risk of
Yeah.
mission drift. They did what they were supposed to do,
Yeah.
which is why I find it so problematic that we're now looking at that being like, by the way, the people representing the social sector at the time were women. So many things were at play there, right? You know, the commercial logic, gender, who was connected to
Yeah,
whom.
but that's where I want to come from, because in fact your results could be applicable to the diversity in any case.
Yeah.
The fact that we have different worldview based on our experiences,
Yeah.
based on, maybe on our gender, if we consider
Yeah.
it's linked
Yeah.
to our experiences.
You're right.
And not specific to these social and economic tensions.
In that study that we have, so that we conducted in France, the one I just presented, we paid attention to gender. And we were curious to see if there would be differences across gender. It is France and boards. I wish I could say we had enough gender diversity to have anything meaningful. Sadly, even in that world, not yet. Right? So I think it's to be looked at, because I was very curious to see that. And the numbers were so small that we couldn't say anything meaningful. I would expect to see differences. And what you're saying is so critically important, and thank you, because I summarized the paper so quickly that I didn't spend enough time on that. Usually, if I presented the paper only, what I would have is a graph showing how the two organizations dealt with the tensions along the way. So the tensions emerged, the trade-offs were constantly there, but they dealt with them in a productive way. Right? It was, and this is echoing another piece that I wrote with Anne-Claire Pache, Meting Sembul, and Jacob Model, now I think it was in 2015, on harnessing productive tensions in hybrid organizations. And in fact, that's what I want to use as a segue into this last part of the talk that I prepared for today. What we found there, not at the level of the board, but inside the organization, is that the organizations, again, work integration, social enterprises, were all facing the tensions. And in some of them, the conflicts became intractable. And in the ones in which the conflict didn't become intractable, there was one thing that they had in common. They had in common what we called at the time spaces of negotiation. That if I had to label now, I would actually probably label spaces of deliberation. Because to me now there's a connection to what we know about democratic decision-making in organizations, but we call that spaces of negotiation at the time. And those were spaces where when the tensions emerged and the trade-offs emerged, everyone had a role to play. And people knew that they had to get together to make those decisions. And making the decision didn't necessarily mean that you and I would agree. In fact, we may agree to disagree, but in a case in which we would agree to disagree, what we would agree on is that the next time we would get together and deal with that trade-offs, if I actually this time got the priority, you would have it next time, and that next time wouldn't be a month from now. It would actually be the day after or the following day where we would be getting together to confront some of those critical issues that we are facing.
So in fact, it's kind of the escalating one that you had, but the first category of the three organizations, but on a more shorter time frame?
I think it's just that people are socialized in such a way that, and it's difficult to do, that they understand, you and I understand, that we are both critical to the fate of this organization. And I understand that you're as needed as I am. And that when we're going to disagree, it's not personal. It's just that the organization is expecting that of us to make sure we remain on track. And so the roles that we have and the way in which we're socialized into these roles is enabling us to engage, to deal with the tension without entering into conflict. And it's hard. It's hard to do, but then if there's a moment when we cannot converge, this is when in those organizations that I studied, democratic decision-making comes into play. That now it's big enough that we have to get all together and say, okay, that's the challenge we're facing, and either it's a small organization and everyone has a say, or we have representatives across the different levels of the organization who then get together and say, okay, this is a big decision we have to make. There is no easy way out. How do we vote on that? Yes.
Just a very small question. To have the data, did you just look at the minutes, or do these companies let you go into the board meetings and attend as a...
Yeah, so it's a combination of both. It's the board minutes that we used and analyzed. Same for the cooperative bank that I mentioned. It was also the board minutes. And then the ability to attend some of the meetings, and then interviews that we conducted. I have to say, though, that what I want to talk about now is going to lead us to also boards again and things that I'd like to be able to do, but it's difficult to have access. And it is difficult. And for, interestingly, this paper with Anne-Claire and Channing is a paper we've been working on for a crazy amount of years. Like, I think it's been 8 years total. And it was just not the craziness of the review process. It was, there's always craziness of the review process, but it was mostly that at some point, we were not able to get the minutes because they were, for the conflicts ones, there was so much at stake that for a number of years, they couldn't give us the minutes. And 5 years later, we went back to them. And a new team had been in place. And our pitch to them was to say, based on the data that we have, it looks like there's something really important we can learn from what happened and the conflict. And at that point, the leadership said, okay, here are the minutes. So it was an interesting situation where we got the data later on for the minutes. And we didn't want to proceed without having all of it. And so at the end of the process, in fact, as we were advancing in the review process, there was one last organization for which we didn't have the minutes, and we finally convinced them, and they said, okay, here are the minutes, because they also saw the studies and the finding, and they thought it was really important to see the extent to which their patterns were aligned or not, and that's how we got the minutes.
They were sure that it was, the name was not...
Absolutely. And as you can tell, I haven't mentioned any of those organizations, and I'm careful not to, even except for Los Andes and Banco Sol, because those are the names. But for the others, you saw some of the companies and organizations I had on that set of presentations, and you shouldn't assume that I've studied them. I might have studied some, not others. I might have not studied any of them, but yeah, I'm being careful on confidentiality, as I should be. Any other questions? Question from outside. Yes.
I have a question regarding the features of dual focus hybrid probes.
Yeah.
Can we say that this type of features can be a response to the detection of hybridity?
One of them, absolutely. But then one of them, absolutely, with the dealing of the tensions, back to what Battilana was saying, not making them disappear, but dealing with them in a systematic way. But only one of them, and that's why I want to spend a bit of time on that last part, just for food for thought for everyone. If I think about my research, I've studied divergent changes in organizations, and power is core and central to that whole stream of research. And then I've studied hybrid organizing, and purpose is core and central to that research. You know that now the term purpose is used a lot in the literature on the pursuit of this multiple objective. It's become quite dominant. So I've conducted academic work like I always do. If I think about what I've done ex post, I realize that I do a set of empirical studies. Then I tend to write those conceptual pieces building on the work that I've done to try and make sense of the phenomenon. And then in both of these streams of research, I always try to take that content to the classroom and to practitioners. And so I've written a series of Stanford Social Innovation Review and HBR articles. And I also wrote that book, Power for All, that I talked about in the class that I taught yesterday, that aims to democratize access to knowledge about power, because what I've seen is that so many of the social change makers who are trying to change corporations or create social enterprises have great ideas, but they too often fail because they don't understand power and what it is and power dynamics. So that's how I've tried to contribute to that movement and help them better understand these critical concepts and tools so that they can be more effective. Now, interestingly, if I think about it, the truth is that up until recently, I had these two streams of research, and I was kind of publishing on them and keeping them quite separate, even though for me they were connected, but I was keeping them quite separate. Up until I started getting all of those findings one after the other about spaces of negotiation or deliberation and more people participating in the decision-making process in these organizations. And I started thinking about the fact that, wait, it's not only that power is connected to changing these organizations, but it could be that power is also core and central to a different way of organizing decision-making power for the pursuit of multiple objectives to be sustained. And so what I want to do now is, and I'm just providing here the definitions. I already talked about that yesterday, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but power is the ability to influence other people. It's derived from control over access to valued resources. I already talked extensively about hybrid organizing, but purpose is defined as an organization core reason for being, and hybrid organization have a core reason for being that's not only about profit, but about social and environmental goals as well, right? So what's striking to me is that research on power and purpose have tended to evolve on parallel tracks. Like, that's what I've done myself, but this is mostly what you see if you look at the literature. And I'm going to make a provocative statement and say, at the beginning of the field of organization theory, if you go back to March and Sayert and Simon, and you look at all of that work, power was obviously core and central, like political coalition. It was at the center of our field. And interestingly, over the past decades, we're publishing all these papers that are all related to power dynamics, but the word power has disappeared. And the analysis of power dynamics has disappeared. Not from all the studies. A number of studies obviously still deal with it. But it's lost the kind of centrality it had in all of the studies we were conducting and publishing in organization theory. So I'm going to argue now that we need to overcome these silos and a low consideration of purpose and power in a systematic way in the studies we conduct, and that I think we need to do that urgently. So let's see if I convince you and how you react to that. So as I said, through my work, I got to see more democratic ways of organizing seem to be helpful in my qualitative studies. It doesn't mean that I'm now saying normatively this is what has to be done. I'm saying I'm asking a question. Could it be that more democratic ways of organizing are more conducive to sustaining the multiple objectives? I think it's a question worth asking. So for decision making, we have to consider the spectrum from decision making is concentrated at the top of the hierarchy of the organization, to decision-making is actually not concentrated at the top, but the way of organizing is much more democratic, and workers throughout the organization have decision-making power either directly, like in a cooperative, or indirectly through workers' representation on boards, such as co-determination models, right, that are prevalent across Europe, especially in Germany, but not only. When it comes to purpose, we go from the triple bottom line, where we pursue all of three of those objectives, to the single bottom line, or it's about profit. So now if we use those simple dimensions, we're getting to have a very simple metrics that I'd like to use now to walk you through different types. Right? What types do we have? We first have the type where you pursue mostly profit and the decision-making power is concentrated at the top. Right? That's what I would call the single-minded oligarchy. Milton Friedman, thank you, Milton Friedman. The social responsibility of business into increase its profits. We know the kind of impact that ideology had in the 1970s on what happened over the past decades. Starting at that time, corporations came under increasing pressure to concentrate on profit maximization. Right? And that became the dominant model in the US and pretty much across the world. Right? So in the single-minded oligarchy, purpose is about, again, profit. Power is concentrated at the top. In those organizations, some organizations may still pursue non-financial goals, but those are considered subordinate to the core goal. Take CSR, at least at the beginning of it. CSR, oh, let's do some CSR, let's do that activity. Oh, it's great because actually it's helping us make more profit because it makes us have a better image and now people think we're doing better, right? Now, that has been the dominant model, but as we've been discussing throughout this whole conversation today, it's been increasingly critiqued. Right? The truth, though, is that what organizations have we studied over the past decades? We've studied mostly single-minded oligarchies. That's what we've studied in mostly, if we look at all of the papers that have been published across fields in organization studies and in management. But you also have other types. One of them is a materialistic democracy. Let me give you an example of that. This is the Kerala Dinesh BD Worker Central Co-op Society. It's a cooperative in which workers participate in all the decision making, including all of the strategic priorities. But it happens to be a cooperative that's dedicated to the production of cigarettes. And their main purpose is profit. Right? So that's a kind of profit-oriented only, very materialistic kind of democracy. In that case, the bottom line is profit. They're organized democratically. Now, if you think about it, it's not only this cooperative. You could have other worker-owned cooperatives, firms with co-determination model. You have a co-determination model. It's a large company, potentially. It's pursuing profit as its main objective. That is a materialistic kind of democracy. And those are not the only two types. We also have the benevolent oligarchy. Because I teach about power, I always love it when people say, what do you think about benevolent dictatorship? To which I always say there is nothing like a benevolent dictatorship. It's a dictatorship. But in that case, we're talking about the benevolent oligarchy. And the benevolent oligarchy actually can exist as such. And let me walk you through. In that case, the purpose is the triple bottom line, right? And power is concentrated at the top. And so if you think about it, certainly this type has been gaining traction because we see increasingly a number of companies saying, we are keeping our traditional hierarchical model, decision-making at the top, but we do care about the pursuit of the multiple objectives. Think about social enterprises, think about some public benefit corporations, Société à Mission, and all of their equivalents here in Europe and across the globe. Because I just made that point about benevolent dictatorship, it would be fair to say, is there something like a benevolent oligarchy? Because if decision-making power is only concentrated at the top and workers have no say, some people would then say, are you really pursuing social objectives as well? So just want to highlight the potential tension there, but this is a model that's becoming more dominant and that we're studying more and more. And to be fair, most of the organizations I studied and I mentioned actually correspond to that model. Patagonia, we were talking about Patagonia earlier, right? Patagonia is a very good example of a benevolent oligarchy. And it's interesting because you probably followed that in 2022, Srinavar, the founder, actually transferred ownership of the company to a trust and non-profit dedicated to environmental protection. But it's interesting to see that all the voting stock of the company was transferred to the trust, which will be overseen by the members of the family and their closest advisors. Right? So again, it's an important evolution, but it's a certain kind, benevolent oligarchy. And then we have the triple bottom line democracy. Example of that, Viva Verde. It's an organization in Boston. Viva Verde is a worker-owned cooperative that's run by Brazilian immigrant women in Boston. They sell house cleaning services using their own natural products that are healthier for the domestic workers, their customers, and the environment. And they vote and make decisions collectively on all the strategic matters that relate to the cooperative and the company. In those situations, the purpose is the triple bottom line. Power is democratically distributed. They not only give workers a voice, workers are the real decision-making power on all of those critical goals. And here you can think about co-determination systems, worker-owned cooperatives that embrace the pursuit of multiple objectives. Right? Now, why is it that I wanted to share that with you? I wanted to share that with you because the thing is that out of all the 4 categories, some have not been studied much. We've studied mostly the first category of the single-minded oligarchy. We're studying more now the benevolent oligarchy. The more democratic forms of organizing have been far less studied, and yet workplace democracy has been around for a long time. So you may be thinking that's what she says, but does she know? So I've actually started a process with Juliette, who's my doctoral student, who's going to be a professor at BU starting in July, and Leszek Kroll, who's my research associate, and we started the very exciting task of reviewing the whole literature on workplace democracy. And what really led me to investing more time in that work is the work I've done with Isabel Ferreiras and Dominique Meda. As I said, my findings were empirically showing to me the importance of more democratic ways of organizing. And Isabel Ferreras has done, as you know, she's one of the members of your faculty here, she's done all of her research on more democratic ways of organizing inside organizations and on teams. And so we together, through the work we've done in the Democratizing Work Initiative and building on the research we're leading together, we wrote that book, Democratizing Work. And in doing that work with Isabel and Dominique and our other co-authors, I grew increasingly convinced that we ought in the field of organization studies to tackle those questions. Like workplace democracies need to be studied. We need to better understand how they function. I'm not saying normatively that this is the way to go. I'm saying, again, could it be that more democratic ways of organizing are conducive to the pursuit of multiple objectives? And so here are the preliminary results of the review. We, for now, reviewed 14 top organization studies and management journals. We're about to open up to 20 more journals across fields, including philosophy, history, political science, economics, social psychology, and so on. We had an initial set of 770 articles that we reviewed, and that led us to identify a set of 261 articles that somehow relate to the topic of workplace democracy and more broadly, worker participation. Now, what are the preliminary findings here? What do we see? Here's what we see. We see that most of those papers on worker participation across field, organization studies, and management, only 22% of those articles actually deal with workplace democracy. And what we mean by that is that they look at situations in which workers have a real structural decision-making power. And that structural decision-making power actually applies to all critical strategic decisions in the organization in terms of the scope. The vast majority of the paper, 53% of them, actually concentrate just on worker voice. So it's a situation in which workers are being consulted, they can pretty much say whatever they want to say, and then the leadership of the company can pretty much do whatever it wants to do, which means completely ignore whatever was said, or account for part of it, or account for the whole thing, depending on their orientation and what they want to do. And the remaining 25% actually concentrate more on self-managed teams in which there is some kind of structural decision-making power on critical daily operation and tasks, but not on the key strategic decisions of the organizations. So isn't it interesting that over the past centuries, cooperatives, workplace democracies have been around. Some people have studied them, right, and across fields, but it's a niche. And those studies have been kept to the side when it comes to mainstream management and organization studies journals. And so this is leading me to the future research directions, and I'm checking the time, right on time, okay? So I'm going back here, and what I'm going to say is we need to pay more attention to those different forms of organizing, and here are the questions that I think are critical and that I'm trying to contribute to addressing now. What are the performance implications, financial, social, and environmental of these four ideal types that I just presented? Can we compare and contrast them so that we get a better understanding of what's going to be most helpful? What role does the institutional context play in the success or failure of each of these ideal types? We cannot just conclude that one doesn't work without accounting for the institutional characteristics of the context. Are more democratic forms of organizing better suited for the pursuit of multiple objectives? Again, I'm asking the question empirically. I think it has to be addressed. What processes, systems, cultures are needed to sustain organizational democracy over the long run? Because it's complicated to do, and we have instances in which it was not done properly, but instances in which it was done properly. Political scientists have been dealing with this. They're asking for our help. They want us to be part of that conversation. Philosophers want us to be part of that conversation. Liz Anderson, an American philosopher, is describing companies as dictatorships. And she's pushing us in a provocative way to say, engage in that conversation, be part of the debate on democracy and organizational democracy. What are the factors that shape which purpose workers choose and prioritize, which, Valerie, goes back to what you were talking about earlier, and can we get a better understanding of that, depending on whether or not it's a democratic forms of organizing. And then, how do organizational democracy and political democracy interact? It's also striking to me, I'm just writing a piece for the 70th anniversary of ASQ at the moment with Christine Beckman and Julianne on this critical question, organizational theory and democracy. The truth is that, again, we've somehow made the collective decision in a conscious or unconscious way to not be part of that conversation. And a lot of our colleagues across fields are turning to us. Organizations are key building blocks of democracies. So what have we learned over the past decades? What do we have to say? And what are the key questions we need to address? That, to me, is also really important for the future of our field in terms of a set of questions that we have to address. And this is it. Thank you so much. I think we're right on time. I'm so grateful for the comments, questions.
Because there again, it gives to workers a specific status, while when we talk about triple bottom line, we can consider also that enter in the decision-making other kinds of stakeholders than workers.
Yes, and so I'm very glad you're saying so. In the paper I've had the pleasure to collaborate with Emilie Aguirre. So Emilie Aguirre is a law professor at Duke. And now maybe almost 10 years ago, she was a young person who just had graduated from a JD program, was getting ready could have decided to go and be a law professor. But she came to me, to my office, and she said, I actually applied for the doctoral program at Harvard Business School. I got into the program. I really want to work with you. And I want to work with you because I need to train myself to understand from an organizational standpoint what it takes to pursue multiple objectives, because I want to help the field of law evolve on that dimension. To which I said, well, listen, don't go for a whole PhD. Like you already have your own PhD, you have your JD. So let's work together. Let's connect with the people who in the field of law do these things. And I said, in fact, I've been looking for them for a long time, and I haven't yet connected with anyone. So I would love to connect with them. And she looked at me and she said, you haven't found anyone because there is no one. Among the people I'm working with, everyone has been telling me we need the younger generation to do it. And I vividly remember that conversation because it occurred to me that she was right, that that's what we had to do. So she did her PhD with me and a number of other faculty members. She graduated, and then that was 2 years ago, and we wrote a piece over the past year that's about redefining and reimagining corporate law. So as you can imagine, especially for the United States, it's a bit provocative to say the least. And we talk about fiduciary duties and how to involve like not only the financial, but also social and environmental performance aspects to that. But we also talk about governance and how to change it. And when we talk about governance and how to change it, among the aspects that we concentrate on are not only workers' representation, but also the representation of the environment. And I educated myself on that dimension. I want to learn more. What I learned is that a number of companies, interestingly, that started in the UK, have actually already included the environment on their board. So I think it raises interesting questions for all of us and for policymakers as well, which is, is there an entity that we need to create, or is it existing entities that are going to play that role, and who's going to be on those boards? But we already have companies that have the environment represented on their boards, and I think this is absolutely critical.
For future generation also. We have
future,
in Belgium where they try to
yes.
very young people as representatives of future generation.
Absolutely, exactly. And then that was the next step that we discussed together with Emilie and Julie, which was the community, social communities in which we evolve, future generations, which I very much like. And this is where I have to say at some point my co-authors were like, we still would want that paper to get a chance to be published. So can we? And so I'm discovering the world of law in the US. You actually send your paper, and it's part of a huge pool of papers, and then law students at various schools decide if they want or not to publish that piece. And we were very fortunate that the Journal of Corporation Law actually jumped on the paper, and they said, this is so core and relevant, let's do it. And so this paper is going to see the light of day. Now it's to be seen the extent to which it's going to be used, but we're going to have a whole year now to further refine. So I would love to learn more about that, because if there are examples of legal arrangements that we can actually include in that piece to make people aware of them in other parts of the world, I'd love to be able to do it. So you're right. And I want to add on that and to be more knowledgeable on that. So thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes?
I have a question regarding the solutions that you offer with the dual focus. I was wondering if there was like a scale impact in the sense that, like let's say a multinational applied it, and the multinational decides to reduce its operations and become, a smaller company, let's say. Can they still apply that to dual focus solutions that reach the same purpose?
So in the cases we studied, those were relatively small or medium-sized companies. So I think the question would be more on the scale, which is a very relevant one. How will that work at the scale of a very large company? And this is where we're touching on the thing I was mentioning, which is I personally would love now, and I've tried. If you have any ideas, please be in touch, let me know. I think the next frontier is working with boards of these companies to look at what happens when these changes happen, like what happens when now the composition of your board becomes different, which is OpenAI is an experiment in the making, right? But there are many others we could look at and we need to look at. I have this dream in mind of a field experiment where, back to what we were discussing, we would have a control group that wouldn't change anything, and a group in which now you would have workers represented on the board. You would also have on that board the environment, potentially future generations represented, and you would have the people with the social mindset and kind of experience and the market one. And obviously we are going to have to create multiple conditions, so we cannot do everything at once. But if we were able to study these things and show the kind of impact it has, I think it'd be fantastic, because we would have answers to those critical questions and at a different scale as well. Based on anecdotal data and evidence from people who sit on these boards and who kind of know the kind of work that I do, very often people reach out to me and they say, I want you to know, like, in that instance, we had workers represented, or in that instance, we had people with these different backgrounds, and what we see on the ground is exactly what you're finding in these other studies. So I expect we would see some of those effects, but obviously it's open for investigation, and we may find that that's not what we find, and then fine, I'd be completely at peace with that, but we need to explore these things. And it's difficult to, back to the minutes, and it's difficult to find access. I even turned to a large social enterprise conglomerate. They had been wanting to work with me for a long time. And I pitched the project to them, and it could absolutely be done inside that conglomerate because they have hundreds of organizations. But then the CEO didn't say that to me in a clear way and directly, but made other people get back to me and say, we're not ready for that. You also have, in terms of power, you also have to agree with power sharing. And so I'm still hopeful that maybe the next generation of leaders in this organization would allow us to do it. But I haven't yet found the kind of environment where we could do that. It'd be fascinating. Yeah.
Please don't have time. Since you picked on OpenAI as a key example, what is your assessment now after this turmoil that they went through? Is the board, is the governance in a stronger position than it was before? What is the balance of the board?
Yeah. Listen, so here's the thing. Look at the profiles of the members. Depends on how you look at them. Do you consider academics to have a social sector orientation? Did you consider a professor in economics who served on the previous US governments, a number of them, to have a social sector orientation? Let's give that board member the benefit of the doubt and say it does have a social sector orientation, which some of you seem to not agree with, some of you would agree with, fine. Then I think we have one other person who has a real social orientation. And so maybe two, not impossible, but they're going to have to be very careful. And Sam Altman has a very important role to play. Can he play that kind of relational leadership role that we've talked about? I actually, to me, it's really important that they succeed and that he does that. I actually do not believe that this is game over. I think this is a moment when that can happen. but they have to be very aware of that. That piece we are just about to publish in SSIR, I promise I'm going to send it to Larry Summers, who's one of my colleagues at HKS, and he's on the board of the organization. So that was, one of the motivations is to say, this is what we've learned. I hope it's going to be helpful to you. And I think they are well-intentioned. These people care deeply about the future of humanity, AI. I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt, but there's a lot at stake. And so I think it's a moment, too, when those of us who've learned about these organizations and alternative models have to share this knowledge with them in the hope that it can also help change the way they're thinking about some of those dimensions. And I don't pretend to have all the answers. I can only share this is what I've seen, and hopefully some of the findings can be helpful. Many other people have done very helpful work that I think could be helpful to them now. But I feel that's what at stake is huge. And so now is the key moment. They have some social orientation represented. My advice to them would be that they need at least one more or two more people who are going to come and who are going to come with the credibility that they need to have to be on that board, which is like you're not marginal players, you're central players and we care deeply. And then that goes back to what we were discussing, which is it's our role to also disagree with each other, to discuss these things so that we can then talk about those KPIs and not enter into an intractable conflict, but sort of talk about knowing that we have the benefit of humanity at heart and we all agree on that, then what are the decisions we need to make as we think about the future of the organization? Yeah.
I just have one, there's something that I cannot help think because I'm much more on consumers, users, citizen perspective. And when you talk about working democracies, to what extent do you consider that it might be relevant to integrate how much workers want to be part of those organizations?
You mean workers not necessarily wanting those responsibilities? Yeah, it's a big challenge. We do have, I think that we need to look more into these things as well. We do have a set of studies coming out now that show that when people participate in the democracy of their workplaces, they become much more active, informed, and enlightened citizens. So I think it's a question for all of us. I think Liz Anderson has a very good point. It's like a state of schizophrenia. We're kind of asked to be citizens and enlightened and participative citizens for those of us who are fortunate enough to be part of democratic countries. And yet at work, we're expected to be very top-down in terms of how we proceed. So what we see is that when people participate, then they participate more at the national, regional, community level as well. So now people not wanting to participate may be due to a number of things. A, it's the power of existing institutions and habits and traditions. We've never done it, why would we do it now? There's also how you incentivize people to do that, which is, I think, something really critical, which is, is it a representative system? Is it a worker-owned cooperative? What goes with that is the question of, do employees have ownership in the company, yes or no? And what I see a lot in the US at the moment is a whole stream, by the way, of people talking about ESOP, which is about employee ownership, but saying employee ownership is the answer. Don't even talk about democratic decision-making. So, those are, again, these things need to be studied. And what if we were to find systems where if it is a representative kind of workplace democracy, those of us who are going to volunteer for a certain period of time to go and represent others should probably then have workload reductions so that we can do that work properly and then go back to our positions later on. From that standpoint, universities represent an interesting model. And I have to say that I am myself at the moment leading one of those situations because a few of my colleagues at Harvard University contacted me a week ago. It was confidential. It's now public to some extent. But what happened is that, believe it or not, at Harvard University, we do not have a faculty senate. So quite top-down, right? And so my vision of these things, based on my research and the beliefs that I have also as a citizen, is that I think we should have a faculty senate. We should also have staff be represented, we should also have students be represented, alumni be represented, and all of these people should elect people who are going to represent them on the board of the corporation. And Harvard University has been going through a lot over the past few months, and certainly in terms of its governance. And I know that what I'm describing now is to you business as usual, because I know this is your governance. I was discussing that with a number of you. For a number of my colleagues at Harvard University, I am a revolutionary on that dimension, because I'm just like what I'm talking about. So the first step that a number of us could converge on was, at least let's have a conversation on creating a faculty senate. Right. And the first step is creating a planning body so that people can vote on whether or not they want a faculty senate. Even faculty members, like depending on the schools, some of them do not even want to have that conversation because they're very happy with business as usual and they do not want to have that kind of additional work. So my hope is that we'll manage to somehow at least have a vote at the scale of each school, but it's incredibly complicated to make happen. And that then the planning body would also think about a way to have people who are going to serve on that Senate get that work be recognized so that they can do it and do it well and be proud of what they do. But it could be that we land in a situation where none of that is recognized and people decide they don't want to do it. So it's interesting where I'm living it as a member of an organization. There is not a single day when I don't say to myself what I would want instead of taking the lead. Is I actually would want to study it and see what's coming out of it and where we're going with that. But it's only fair enough that, I just have to play a role in it. That makes a lot of sense and there is no escaping it and it's really important. But you're right, and I see that within my own schools and at my own institution. But I think it has to do a lot with habits and with what, kind of culture and your education. You're right, exercising that civic muscle. In chapter 8 of the book, Power for All, we put a lot of emphasis on that. And if I think about some of the most important things, I think we have to reform the way we teach civic education at school, like middle schools, high schools, even at the university, so that we make it part of our normal life to play those roles as part of democratic organizations and democratic institutions. But again, let's study these things and see the extent to which we can pursue those multiple objectives and do better. On the organizational dimension, I'm perfectly willing as an organization studies researcher to say, I don't and should not be normative. Let's look into that. At the national level, this is where even as a researcher, I'm normative. And I think that we should think about how we enhance and protect democracy. And we organizational scholars, I think, have a role to play. Thank you. Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.